we're about to start the video. Down 1, 2, 3. So if you like, you can go to our Facebook page, Poison Pen, whatever it is. I don't do social media, I do the Instagram account, but not the Facebook account. And you can share it to your own Facebook page, and then you can tell all your friends who didn't make it here that you were here. You were also here eating Karen. I have to thank her again. She's created a poison pen scone recipe, and she brought them. Don't you love it? Our own scones. It's so cool. So she brought them along. Now, I am wearing my only version of a Victorian costume, which is the best I could do. My doctor at Mayo is a costumer, so she made the jacket for a Larry King event. Skirts from Santa Fe. The shoes are from Germany. But, you know, I did my best. And we are having another Victorian author, Charles Finch, whom we know and love, will be here on February 16th, a Sunday afternoon. So I'm planning to bring it back. And maybe Karen will make more scones. Right. Anyway, I'm Barbara Peters. I'm the owner of the Poison Pen. Thank you so much for coming. How many of you are new to the store? A lot of you, right? Oh, wow. Look at that. Invited by Karen? Mostly. Okay. She's better than the Arizona Republic and our own social media guide. So we really appreciate your coming. So what we do, since some of you are new, is we're going to sit here and talk for God knows how long. And we digress because that's part of the fun. And then we'll have questions and answers. And then at the end, we're going to ask you to stand up and fold up your chairs so we can put them all back and line up here to get your, by number, to get books signed. So. And I forgot to bring my giveaway book, which is somewhere up in the front, but I have Charles Finch's book, which I'm planning to give away whenever I find it, to somebody that we will call by number. So that's kind of what we do, right? So welcome, Karen and Tasha. Oh. So on the far left is Tasha Alexander, one of my favorite authors. Her husband, Andrew Grant, the tallest person in the room, is also one of my favorite authors. He's doing an event here Tuesday night with Nicholas Petrie, so that's going to be Thriller Night, which is a different night, right? A very different night, right? Sometimes Tasha and Andrew do events together, and it's a little schizophrenic. But today we are doing Victorian, and in your case, Tasha, we've moved on to Edwardian.
Yeah, we're Edwardian now. I never thought Victoria would actually kick the bucket. I never thought I would get there, but we're in 1902, so she's not just dead; she's buried.
And you've written, which maybe, well, we won't go into the British royal family disaster, but I will say, for those of you who read historical fiction, it's not any different than the children of George III, or in fact, the children of Victoria. It's just that we are not quite used to it.
Yeah, well, and I think royalty has never really had a lot of privacy. And I think we sort of think that now with social media and the internet that that's a new thing, but you know, they knew what was going on in the 19th century. People had concerns about a lot of those princes.
So Tasha writes a series about Lady Emily, who has had an interesting life. She became a widow without ever really knowing her first husband, and now she's married to, and has been for quite a while, a second husband who has a mysterious job. And she tends to go to interesting places. At this time, it's Pompeii, which is fabulous. So Tasha, in order to write with verisimilitude, you actually went to Pompeii.
I did actually go to Pompeii, and I had always wanted to go to Pompeii. I think I was about 6 years old, and I was reading an issue of National Geographic magazine that had an article about Pompeii in it. And, you know, it's morbid but true. I think we're all morbidly fascinated by the casts of the bodies. Because it's not just like seeing a skeleton or seeing a mummy. You're seeing a cast of the actual, you can see the face, you can see their hair, you can see details of their clothing, and I just thought, this is really gross and cool.
And so what better than to have a cast of a body that has actual sideburns still growing?
Still growing?
Well, not quite, because he's been dead a little while. Still fresh, let me put it that way. Back from growth.
And historically inaccurate for an ancient Roman.
So we suspect, in fact, that it's not an ancient Roman, but a relatively fresh body. What a clever disguise for a killer, right?
Well, you know, partly that because I hadn't decided how I was going to start the book and where the body was going to be. But then when I went to Pompeii, I spent quite a lot of time in Pompeii. and the surrounding area. And you know, there are sections in the ruins where there are groups of bodies displayed, or casts of the bodies displayed. And some of them are quite famous. The Garden of Fugitives, you've probably seen pictures of it, you know, and people are kind of, it's really poignant because you can see them in their last pose, and they don't look comfortable. You know, they have volcanic ash falling on them and hot poisonous gases surrounding them, and they're dying, and they're, you know, in these really heart-wrenching poses. And they're also, some of the casts are in the museum. But as you start, if you take more time, a lot of people just have a day at Pompeii, or maybe 2 days, but I was there for an extended trip. And once you kind of get off the beaten path in the excavations, because this is an entire city. They haven't excavated all of it, but this isn't like going to the Acropolis, which is this contained group of ruins. It's the whole town. And as you start wandering around the little side streets and the alleys and in and out of different houses and bakeries and restaurants and shops, every once in a while you do just come upon another cast. And some of them are marked on the map, but it is Italy after all, so some of them are not marked on the map. And it just dawned on me that if you wanted to hide a body, doing it in plain sight like this would be the way to go.
Right, and Tasha's books don't always start like this. She's been to Vienna, she's been to Pompeii, she's been to Paris, you know, so this is not one of your glamour beginnings.
No, not so much glamour, unless you like dust and ruins and dead bodies, ancient dead bodies. But I think the thing with and I know we're technically Edwardian now, but the Victorians, particularly the British, they had such a wonderful tradition of traveling. If you had money and you were in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you would travel, even as a woman. A woman could travel. And so as much as they would like to go to Paris and Vienna and places like that, they were also there was a keen interest among people in exploring sites of historical importance. And Pompeii was certainly one of them that people wanted to go see.
Absolutely. It was a golden age of travel. I was really sad to see Thomas Cook, who was really the Brit who kind of invented it all and built some extraordinary hotels. I was in Egypt in December and actually stayed in the Old Cataract Hotel, which is where Agatha Christie began Death on the Nile, because you went up the Nile, it's now Lake Nasser, to the Second Cataract from there. And I thought it was really heart-wrenching that he went bankrupt. The company went bankrupt, but they didn't really catch up with modern travel. So sometimes innovators get stuck.
I think, though, that Amelia Peabody would be very glad to hear that news.
I think she would, too. I wore my Another Shirt Ruined t-shirt yesterday, for those of you who know Amelia Peabody. So, Karen, we're in London, right?
Yes.
Are you on? I'm not sure. Here, take mine. All right. No, I think you're on. You can hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So, and this is your second book, A Trace of Deceit. It's absolutely fabulous. I loved all of the art that you brought into the story. Well, why don't you go back and tell us a little bit about the first book, since we have an opportunity. This is Tasha's 15th book, so we can't really reprise the first 14.
It would take days and you'd be very bored.
No, you wouldn't be bored, but it would just take too long. But anyway, Karen, take us back to the first book and tell us about your lead character, where she came from.
Well, my very first book was actually just an ebook and an audiobook from Random House. That was The Lady in the Smoke. It was never put into print, something that some people are kind of unhappy about. But I began with A Lady in the when I began A Lady in the Smoke, it was coming out of my doctoral dissertation. I had done a dissertation at NYU, graduating way back now, 2002, on Victorian railway disasters. And when I decided I wanted to write a book, I thought, what do I know more than most people know? I mean, I was at home with my son, Kyle, who was here. He was 2, and I was reading Goodnight Moon a lot. And I needed to kind of get back to something that was using my brain. And my dissertation was trying to examine where trauma came from. A lot of people think of trauma now as, I mean, we sort of throw the word around, people use it somewhat casually, I think, and when you trace the history back, a lot of times people find the founding moment in World War I with shell shock. If most of you have probably heard about that. But if you take a look and you go back even further, you will find the beginnings of discussions of trauma with the railway accidents in the 1860s and 70s in the medical literature. They were talking about people who had bizarre symptoms that they couldn't account for. And some of you know that Charles Dickens was in a railway accident in 1865. His entire carriage toppled over on its side. He had to crawl out, and he dragged his mistress Ellen Ternan after him. She was the actress that he was hanging with while his wife was at home with the children. And
all 9 of them.
All 9 of them. And actually Ellen Ternan's mother came out, and also his manuscript for our mutual friend. And he walked around ministering to people. He had some brandy with him, and he walked around helping people and giving people brandy and water and doing what he could to help people. And then they sent an express train from London to fetch everyone. So he, along with everybody else, hops on. They go back to London. And the next day he wakes up and he has ringing in his ears and he can't sign his name and his left leg is shaking. He starts having nightmares. He can't sleep. He'll fall asleep at his desk because he doesn't want to go to bed. And he died 5 years to the day after the accident. And his son said he never recovered. But there was no visible symptom. I mean, he got up and walked around afterwards. And the doctors were encountering cases like this, and as a result of a specialty came into being called railway surgery. And so in my first book, we have Lady Elizabeth, who's in a train wreck at the end of chapter 1. She drags herself, gets herself out, gets her mom out, and they meet a railway surgeon who is there in the field helping. And this was very usual for railway accidents. They would have whatever doctor or nurse or whoever would come to the field in a wagon, do what they could to help. They'd load people onto wagons, and then they'd take them back out to hotels, guest houses, anywhere that they could, because obviously you're not going to have a hospital convenient to the field. And so that's kind of where my book began, and I sort of got trapped in the 1870s. I could explain later the reasons that I think the 1870s are the most interesting era of the Victorian period. But then the second book, I was about a young woman who had to dress as a man to play in a music hall in Soho. In the Victorian era, not surprisingly, she wants to earn money to go to the Royal Academy, like Fanny Dickens did. This was Charles Dickens' older sister, who was wildly talented. She studied actually with a student of Beethoven. But she ran out of money, and so she couldn't stay at the Royal Academy of Music, and she ended up having to abandon her studies, which I thought was really tragic. But in my book, she decides, I'm going to earn the money myself. And so she goes over to Soho, and she finds out very quickly that men get paid 20 shillings a week for performing, and women get paid 10. So she puts on male garb, and she goes over there and earns money for her tuition. But in the meantime, finds out that the music hall is also home to a thieving ring. And she kind of gets caught up in that. So, but again, I'm still in the 1870s, and I there are some people, Tasha being one of them, who can do a series with a repeating character and do it well and keep it interesting and have the character grow and change. And I don't really feel like I can do that very well. I really like to have a new character each time. So in this third one, Annabelle Rowe is an artist at the Slade School, which was opened in 1871. In London, and by a very forward-thinking man named Felix Slade, who believed that men and women should study art together. And this was revolutionary because what are you going to do about the anatomy classes, right? So a whole bunch of men went in to protest to Mr. Slade and said, no, we can't have women here. And his solution was drape the loins, get on with it. And so the women were allowed in from the very, very first class. And
Can I interrupt you and say, this is an era when they were draping piano legs, so people would be sensitive, to the whole issue of legs of anything showing. So you can imagine what it would be, if you had actual live people doing that. So Tasha, have you run into that?
Yeah, well, the thing that I always find so interesting about the Victorians is that on the one hand, they're draping piano legs. On the other hand, they're having charts at country house parties to keep track of who's in what room the next morning because they know everyone's having an affair. So hypocrisy maybe isn't quite the right word because I think it has the wrong connotation. It's that this was a very different society in a lot of ways, and a lot of marriages were business arrangements. And so they weren't trying to just be lascivious. They were trying to find some affection, which they weren't going to find in their marriage, very likely. But you didn't then want to be, humiliating your spouse. So you get this sort of weird, where you get people now thinking, oh, those Victorians, they were such prudes. Well, they were not prudes. But they were discreet.
Right.
They were discreet.
Interestingly enough, the New York Times has these little things about modern love. I don't know any of you ever read them, but I do. And today, it was about two couples in what they called an open marriage, and it was ticking along until one of them got knocked off his motorcycle and into ICU with a head injury, and then the wife of the other couple goes to sit with him, and the husband of the wife, who is not, wonders if he can get into the ICU and claim he's a relative. And what will he do if he does? And, and I thought, okay, it's actually not that different in the Victorian arrangements, except we call it modern love, and they called it just getting on with things.
Exactly. Well, I mean, you get, there's pornography in the Victorian world. There's people, you've got all the prostitutes in the East End. People were having sex. In fact, I can't remember his name, that's escaping, an academic who wrote a book about Victorian morality. He says that at the height, like in the peak, like the middle of Victoria's reign, 60% of middle class girls were pregnant when they got married. So somebody was having sex, and they weren't once you were engaged, who really cared, right? But it's funny, because now I think people are a little, maybe not so much right now, but certainly I can think like when I was in college, people seemed more prudish than I would say a lot of Victorians were.
But it's not that new. I remember going to Anne Hathaway's cottage, which is, Shakespeare and Shakespeare country in England, and they actually had an article of furniture called a courting bench, which was a bench with a high back and sides and a curtain you could draw, so that if you were an engaged couple, you could sit or lie in the courting bench, and everybody was all around you, so they must have been quiet. I mean,
it makes me wonder how good they were at it.
We have children in the audience, so let's move along here. But
before we move along, I want to mention that there was a society called the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and it was in place. Obviously, it was in place because somebody felt like there was vice out there, and so it's one of those things. It wouldn't have been around if there weren't something that they were responding to. So.
This was also an age when people were moving from gin to dope because there were no analgesics. And so in the 18th century, people drank gin, which is a relatively new thing, especially in England, as a pain reliever to a great degree, kind of like the opioid epidemic we have today. But in the 19th century, because of the Afghan wars and everything, they brought in opioids. And so they used to swig laudanum. They gave it to children. They used to rub it on their gums when they were teething and so forth. So we think we have an opioid epidemic today, but in fact it was running rampant in the Victorian age as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about history. People have this idea that we've made this sort of linear progression from crawling out of the primordial swamp to now, and that we're just very nicely going along, getting more enlightened, getting more intelligent, figuring out the way the world. We're no different than those people were. And they care about the same things we care about. The clothes are different, the social mores are different, but the fundamental humanity is the same.
Well, there are some differences. When I was in Egypt, I went to see the corpse of the mummy of Ramses II, who lived to be 96, and I'm not sure they calculated years quite the same we do. But they pointed out that he has all his wisdom teeth were impacted. He had abscess. He had like the most horrible mouth ever, preserved. And I mentioned it to my dentist, that imagine living to be 96 tortured by your teeth. So we have made some progress.
We have made progress. Dental progress. And now we're going to get off on one of our tangents, but, and Andrew, my husband, knows about this very well. Before World War I, the state of people's teeth in the United States was considered one of the greatest threats to national security. Because if you had bad teeth, how are you going to go fight in a trench for 4 years? How are you going? You can't do anything, really, if you've got terrible, terrible tooth pain.
That's true. One more aside, we'll go back to Karen. While I was there also, for years and years, it was thought that Hatshepsut, who was the first male pharaoh, she's a woman, but actually ruled as a man, had been murdered by her stepson, whom she bumped off the throne and who came back and took it when she died. Recently, they found a mummy, and they found a tooth. And they finally identified the mummy as Hatshepsut, and the mummy is missing a tooth. So the tooth matches the mummy, and what they discovered was she died of an abscess. She wasn't murdered at all. She died from her tooth. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that you can overturn, because I mean, I've read novels about Hatshepsut and how she was murdered by Tutmos and the whole thing. A whole historical theory blown up by modern forensics. So it's just so cool. Anyway, back to you. Sorry. We could talk about how hard it was for women to actually earn money. There were so few jobs that were open to genteel women.
It's true. They, governess,
Ladies, well, companion.
companion, ladies' companion, yeah. There were some women who were making it as artists. Not very many, but some.
Right.
And
There's a French
A few
woman,
writers.
Madame Vigée Lebrun, who made an absolute fortune as an artist before and after the French Revolution, for example. But that's really rare.
yes, yeah. And some of them made good money as models. As models for artists. Some of them did. There was maybe an actress, I guess. There was another option. But in this book, Annabelle is modeled after a woman named Kate Greenaway, who actually made very good money as an illustrator for children's books. She was one of the first. She was in that first class at the Slade. So yeah, it's
Awesome.
a good thing.
Like the woman who wrote Peter Rabbit, for example, was able to make. And by the way, I saw the preview for the new Peter Rabbit, which is coming out in April. It's absolutely adorable. Peter is just like super. It was so cute. I can't wait to see it. Right.
Well, one of the things that I was telling Tasha before we began that intrigued me so much about your book was how gender weaves its way into both your plot and a couple of your subplots, where you have a woman in '79, and I'm not going to do any spoilers here, but she cannot publish the poems, this exquisite poetry that she's writing under her own name. And then you have 1902, ostensibly again in this linear progression, which isn't really happening. And in 1902, there's a incredibly talented archaeologist who has to pretend she's somebody's sister in order to get on a dig.
You
So-
can't have unmarried women going around and working. I mean, that's going to cause havoc. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, we still have things that make it difficult for women. I mean, that hasn't really changed, and neither has being paid less than men. But what you do find in history is that you get women who figure out how to contort themselves in these convoluted ways to still do what they really want to do. I mean, they shouldn't have to do that, but they do. And so Callie, the archaeologist, I mean, again, I'm trying to try not to give anything away, but, well, actually, I can give away that, Vesuvius erupts. I think everyone knows that, right? Okay. But not in 1902. If you were a woman, particularly of middle or upper class, there were ways that if you had more money, things were easier. But a lot of the professions open to women were kind of more demi-mode. So if you needed to earn a living, you were destroying your reputation at the same time. So Callie, who is a trained archaeologist and really good at what she does, can't get a job in her own right, partly because she's not married. And like I said, you can't have this woman traipsing around ruins with men. What will she do? How will they control themselves? But if she has a family member, I mean, because think about how absurd this is. So her brother's there, so that's okay, because he'll chaperone her. I mean, I have brothers, let me tell you. That's not going to really help anyone. But this is the kind of thing that women faced. That you'd have this absurd, it didn't matter how smart you were, how capable you were, there were social niceties that had to, be observed.
Speaking of volcanology, and I think that we still have some copies, Robert Harris, who you may have run across, wrote a book called Pompeii. I think I ordered copies in for this, I certainly hope so. which is an absolutely brilliant book that does take place in 79 AD. And what's really interesting about it is all the people living there, there were signs about what was going to happen, but of course nobody understood them. So, you know, there are rumblings and there's whatever it all is. And you just know, it's one of those books where you know the disaster is about to overtake every character, but the characters don't know that. And so it's a really interesting book to read, but I thought he truly did his homework about volcanoes and how they work.
He
It's
did.
just a great
It's
book.
a wonderful book. But one of the things that just shocked me when I started doing research, I assumed that the Romans knew Vesuvius was a volcano. But they had no idea that was a volcano. They just thought it was a mountain that hadn't erupted for centuries and centuries. And in fact, Spartacus, when he was in the midst of his famous slave revolt, he and the slaves hid in the crater of Vesuvius. Because the slope of the mountain was just this as you get with volcanic land, the soil's very fertile, you've got vineyards growing up the side of the mountain, it's lush, it's green. And the ancients at this point hadn't connected seismic activity with volcanic activity. So Pompeii had earthquakes constantly, and that was all connected to Vesuvius. But you think about people in San Francisco, right? They're just used to earthquakes. And you read about Pompeii and people's accounts of living there, you know, and obviously having left before the volcano erupted, they are so used to earthquakes. They were just sort of saying, okay, earthquake, yeah, all right, back to work. Because you can't, if you're going to choose to live in a place that there are earthquakes, you can't be paralyzed every time there's an earthquake.
And what more, they're still doing it.
Well, that's it, because now you have somewhere between 2 and 3 million people living in the Bay of Naples. Hi, we know about Pompeii. We know about Vesuvius. Mount Etna's right there. You know, you've got actually 3 active volcanoes. They could never evacuate all those people.
No, I remember when I was there, the guide pointed out that Vesuvius goes and it's actually kind of projected that, well, there's no chance that they can evacuate all the people living there. So I find it interesting that many of us choose to live in willful blindness.
Yeah.
You know, I actually have a friend who built a house on the San Andreas Fault. And I thought, okay.
You're going to go quickly if you go.
If she sinks into the earth, no tears for me.
It
right?
was a beautiful house until the earthquake.
I know.
But you know, one thing that I also found interesting about the whole Vesuvius eruption is that you have 2 cities that were quite famous. You have Pompeii and you have Herculaneum that's very nearby. Pompeii is where you get all the casts of the body. And Herculaneum until, maybe the 80s, they hadn't found a single human remain in Herculaneum. So people kind of thought, okay, well, they must have looked up and saw smoke and said, let's get out of Dodge. But in fact, they didn't. In fact, what we learned, partly because of excavations and partly because of the eruption of Mount St. Helens in, was that 1980, 81? So Pliny the Younger wrote a really famous letter. He watched the eruption of Vesuvius from his mother's villa that was on the correct side of Vesuvius to not get hit. So he saw it, and he wrote the historian Tacitus a letter describing exactly what he saw. And it's very detailed. And for centuries, volcanologists kind of dismissed it as unreliable eyewitness testament, right? Eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. You think you saw something, you weren't taking it down. So they sort of always took that with a grain of salt because nobody had ever seen an eruption like this until Mount St. Helens erupted. And that eruption was step by step exactly how Pliny described it. And in fact, that kind of eruption is now called a Plinian eruption. But what happened with Herculaneum is where with a volcano you get the ash comes up and falls, and that's what was happening in Pompeii. But in Herculaneum, it was all the pyroclastic flow where you get this hot gas that comes down the mountain in a matter of, say, 4 minutes. You didn't have time to flee Herculaneum. They were just all dead immediately because it was just too fast and they didn't know what was happening. But archaeologists found, the Romans were very good at their public building initiatives, and Herculaneum was on the coast. So you've got a port with those wonderful Roman vaults, the brick, and the Romans overbuilt everything. So people, once they knew something was wrong, fled and hid in these kind of cellar isn't the right word, but kind of a place where if you were a ship person, you would store your cargo. So they found all of these skeletons in there because the people had just all died.
Could I say that actually this is a very good murder mystery, but investigation. It is not an historical novel, it is not volcanology or whatever, but it's really a lot of fun to read, and for those of you who like traditional mysteries, that's what Tasha writes, aside from all this wonderful stuff we're talking about. But back to Karen, because I think your book is absolutely sensational, and what I really, and Tasha's as well, I really love the way you brought in the art world, but there is a mystery as well, which we haven't touched on. So you want to just set it up for us briefly? No spoilers.
I'm thinking about no spoilers, no spoilers. Okay. Well, I actually want to tell, I'm going to do a detour and do a really quick explanation of why I chose art for this next book.
Okay.
The piano in the second book was really sort of a result of my father passing away and beginning to recognize things belatedly about him. He was sort of a loner. The piano was his language. The piano was his companion when he was growing up. He had two older brothers who were football players. He was kind of a small guy who didn't play football, and he loved his piano. So the piano was his friend, where the two of them would go out and play football. And so Dangerous Duet, to some extent, came out of that. This came out of an experience I had when it was on my 29th birthday. And I was working for Christie's Auction House, and I didn't know anything at all about art. I really am one of these people who, when I go to those paint your own pottery places, my daughter Julie used to drag me to them, I face that blank white plate, the way people say they face a page. I would do polka dots because I couldn't do anything else. Anyway, and which is why I had to channel a couple of my artist friends who are here, Hallie and Heidi, both of them were really kind. They let me sort of walk around inside their head and ask, what is it like to be an artist? How do I talk about a brush? And, but anyway, so I was at Christie's and I was buying media, print media space. So New York Times, Architectural Digest, Art and Auction, Main Antiques Digest, all of these different publications. And I'd been there a few months, and there was a famous, there was going to be a big rare book auction on November 11th, and the star of the auction was going to be Leonardo da Vinci's Codex Hammer. This is one of his notebooks with 32 pages, and it's all in his mirror writing, so you read it back to front. And the most famous image, I think, is the Vitruvian Man. It's the one with the circle, and the man is inside it. That's in that notebook. And so I am standing on the side of the main floor. Stephen Massey, who is the auctioneer, is up front, and across from me is a bunch of tables draped in black, and it's staffed by a bunch of Christie's employees who are going to be taking phone bids for people who couldn't be in the room. But I'm standing on this side of the room, and I'm looking out, and there are rows of people. And generally, people who come to Christie's auctions are pretty well behaved. There's not a lot of hooting and hollering. There's no mad paddle waving. But the room wouldn't settle. It just wouldn't settle down. Everyone's whispering, and there was this kind of energy in the room that was astonishing. So the bidding begins. I think he began the bidding at $6 million. So, 6.5, 7, 7.5, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, 6. I mean, it just keeps climbing, and it gets to the point where there's 2 people left bidding. One's in the room, he keeps raising his paddle, and one is in the phone thing. And it's a woman, and she just keeps raising her hand. And I mean, even now, I'm getting chills. It was a really intense moment. And finally, it went to the bidder on the phone, and nobody knew who it was at first. And later on, a couple hours afterwards, I overheard someone say that it was Bill Cates. And then someone said, no, it's not Cates, it's Gates. He does something with computers. This is in 94, and Windows 95 is still 8 months down the road. And, but it was the first time that the knowledge of the kind of stories that swirl around art and the kind of suspense that can get created around art really hit me. I mean, all the way down to the bone. And so when I came to writing this book, I began with art because there's so many great mysteries in art, but I had a backlog of a desire to write about art. And a friend of mine actually recently mentioned another great story. It was about a 90-year-old woman in France who had this 17th century masterpiece. It had been hanging over her stove for years. She thought it was a knockoff. Over her stove. I know, you think about this, right? It was hanging over her stove for years, and she thought it was a knockoff. And it turned out to be the real thing, and it's worth something like $70 million. And these are the kind of stories that grab me, and I feel like I have to, you know, do something with them.
Oh Lord, everybody loves a treasure hunt, right? Don't we all wish we could discover the Beethoven manuscript in the attic, or, you know, we had that thing in Tucson that was such an interesting story, and they've never been sure about whether that couple really, you know, cut, I'm trying to think, it's the Kooning, right? Cut the Kooning out of the frame, and anyway, when they died, when she finally died, they found it hanging in the bedroom where you couldn't see it unless you went into the room, because it was behind the door. And nobody's ever really quite worked out what happened, and if it were they, because why did they do it? Were they overcome? I mean, I don't personally think de Kooning is the kind of thing that would drive me to cut it out of the frame and take it to New Mexico. But no, but you know, we each respond differently to art, and that is actually one of the great things about art. It's one of the great things about books, right? And wine. Everyone's palate is different. I spend a lot of time saying to people, if you don't like the book you're reading, just put it down, throw it away, give it away, and move on. Life is too short to read bad books. It's really true. And I think, you know, there's no way that just because I love it, that I can expect anyone else to love it, right? You know, you've probably all had that experience of being excited about something and trying to share it and running up against indifference, if not contempt, right? It just works out that way. Which is what's so great about today is that we all three like each other's work, right?
Yeah.
Yay. And Karen, who is really does read a lot and does read the books of the people that come here, and I didn't send Tasha a copy of the book, so if she hasn't read it, it's my fault.
I was planning to get it signed today, so.
But so you're going to read it afterward, right? Dana's home reading it right now because I told her how much I loved it. But anyway, you know, it's a voice that really speaks to me, and you'll have to decide whether it speaks to you. But if it doesn't, that's okay. You can hand it on to somebody else, right?
Yep. But I think it's a really brilliant idea to approach a series not from the point of view of a single character. Because it's so easy to just have that just get too formulaic and too, you know, you paint yourself into a corner a bit. And instead of just taking that narrow view that a series has to be about a person, it's about more like a feeling and something that inspires something. And that can be the string through all of it, the thread through it all. It doesn't have to be a person. And I think that's genius.
Well, it's a community. And I do have some characters who link up. So in Dangerous Duet, Nell, my musician, her brother works for Scotland Yard. He's an inspector. This causes problems when she's running into, you know, her two separate lives begin to clash. But Matthew, he becomes the inspector at the very beginning of this book. Who takes on the case. What happens is Annabelle is very anxious. Her brother Edwin he's 3 or 4 years older than she is, and he's sort of a ne'er-do-well. Opium addict, you know, but we're back to the drugs, you know. And he was caught forging. He was put in jail for a year. He's been out for 4 months. He swears he's gone clean. He's going to live lawfully. He's going to do all the right things, and but Annabelle's heard this before, and so she's a little leery of believing him and entrusting him. But for the past 4 months, he's been meeting her every couple weeks, and he shows up. He's on time. He's not drunk. He's not on drugs. He seems to have paint on his hands and talks about his work that he's doing, and he's not forging, ostensibly. And so she has an anxious feeling. She hasn't heard from him in a couple of weeks. She's worried. And so she goes to his flat. And she climbs up, and the door is open. And these 2 strange men are there, kind of riffling through his stuff. And she says, "Who are you and what are you doing?" And they turn around, and she sees one of them as a truncheon. And she says, "Oh, plainclothes detectives. Okay, what's my brother done now?" Except that he's dead. So that happens in chapter 1. I'm not giving a whole lot away. But you know, a good part of the rest of the book, when I began thinking about, okay, the mystery is, okay, why did Edwin die? And there is a painting, which you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, a Boucher painting that is missing. He was cleaning it for auction. It was supposed to be auctioned off in a couple of weeks. Well, all of a sudden it's gone. Except that somebody thinks it might have been a forgery, and it was supposed to have burned in the Pantechnicon fire of 1874, which was a real thing. 3 full days, full-on burning, an entire, I mean, $700 million worth of paintings, furniture, and art was burned in 3 days, and it was right there in the center of Mayfair. And so the mystery is, okay, so was it the real painting? Why is it gone? Why did he die? But the other piece of this is the personal piece, which is she wants to know, was her brother telling the truth before he died? Had he truly reformed? Or was he kind of going back to his old tricks? And it's really important for her, for personal closure. So that's the gist of the mystery. So.
And that's why I brought up the opium thing, is that what's going on with the brother is not uncommon at all. There were loads of people, and it didn't have the same stigma. You didn't have to have a prescription. You could just buy laudanum, like on any street corner or whatever, make up your own formula.
Go to the opium dens.
You could, yeah. There are lots of ways to get it. Sort of like patent medicine, which was 99% alcohol, but people, were convinced it was good for them. Tasha, before we open it up to questions, tell us a little bit about Colin and Lady Emily, because all we've talked about is Pompeii, but in point of fact, who are your protagonists?
Well, so Emily, as Barbara said, she, in the first book, is a recent widow, and so we've been following her for all these books, so I won't go into all this detail, but Colin was her first husband's best friend, who she didn't really know. Well, she didn't really know her husband, so why would she really know his best friend? But when I set her up as my protagonist, I wanted to really think a lot about social change, which is such a big piece of the Victorian period. And there are lots of really famous iconoclasts in that time who were fighting for social change from the very beginning. But to get wholesale change in a society, you need not just the iconoclasts to be wanting it. You need people who aren't necessarily benefiting from that change to start fighting for it too, before you get enough of a wave that an entire culture is going to change. So I wanted to take a young woman who had money, who had rank, who, she's not working in a match factory on the East End. She's comfortable and she has everything she wants. So I wanted over the course of the books to explore how a person like that in that time period would go from basically just being a spoiled society girl, a smart spoiled society girl, but she didn't have a lot of options. So to go from that to being someone who is educated and intelligent and conscious of what's going on in the world around her, and starting to see that the world she lives in is really, really unjust. And Colin, her husband, he is an agent for the crown who does things that require lots of discretion. And Emily,
basically, black ops is what he's doing for the crowd.
Yes, exactly.
In modern terms.
Exactly. And he's a little more conflicted about their society than I think Emily is in a lot of ways. He's not really keen on Victoria or the royal family, for that matter, or the monarchy. But he is an English gentleman, and he is going to do his duty and support Queen and Country, as he should, even if he doesn't always feel great about it.
When was MI6 formed?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Andrew, you know that.
When was MI6 formed? The Second World War? Is it a growth out of the James Bond and that whole as special ops?
Second World War.
This is the 50th anniversary of James Bond. You all know that? Daniel Craig coming back. I went to see the Star Wars, which I hated. But it was not nearly as good as the last one, but the previews were great. Peter Rabbit, Daniel Craig.
See, I can't get there with Daniel Craig. He looks like a Bond thug. Not even the villain, the thug, okay? And this is when he's dead to me. And as Bond, I'm sure he's a lovely person. I don't have any personal issues with him. But in Casino Royale, he stumbles into whatever bar and orders a martini, and he's all beat up and, Well, first of all, James Bond doesn't stumble around, okay? James Bond has the crap kicked out of him and then saunters in elegantly and orders his martini, right? Not Daniel Craig. Bartender says, do you want that shaken or stirred? And he says, do I look like I care? I was like, if you're James Bond, you care. You're like half dead, and you know how you want your martini, and it matters.
So you're just proving my rant earlier about different palettes.
Yes.
A lot of people really like Daniel.
No, they do.
A lot
And
of
I mean,
people don't.
no, it's just, to me, that's what's fundamental about Bond. Like, I love Bond because he's independently wealthy. He's doing this out of noblesse oblige. He's a gentleman. He's suave. He's gonna get it done and look good doing it.
Okay. So,
That's how you really feel.
let me leave by saying that you can actually, in one sense, read Tasha's books and Karen's as kind of, I don't want to say romantic, but you can read them in a very kind of like romantic suspense and murder and all. You don't have to go down into the background, the social issues, what's really going on in society. You can just read them as great stories and murder investigations and have a great time, or you can come here and find out that there are hidden depths, right? So that's the message to take away from today. Who would like to ask questions? And, oh, sorry, right. Thank you for watching us on video today. And I would like to say goodbye and wish you a happy weekend.